A highly respected Atlanta attorney known for commanding courtrooms did not meet his end peacefully. Gary Farris was found on his sprawling 10-acre estate, reduced to ash and bone fragments in a smoldering backyard burn pile. The jarring contrast between his immense wealth and his primitive disposal is staggering. Sifted from the blackened debris was a single, deformed .38 caliber bullet, lodged deep within a charred rib. A man who built an empire, literally burned to the ground. Please support the channel by subscribing and liking this video. Thank you so much. Drive north from the dense, concrete sprawl of downtown Atlanta, and the landscape gradually shifts. The highways give way to winding two-lane blacktops, thick canopies of pine trees, and the oppressive humidity of Cherokee County, Georgia. It is a region where generational wealth often hides behind heavy iron gates and long gravel driveways. At the end of Purcell Lane sat a sweeping 10-acre estate. It was a property that demanded relentless upkeep, a sprawling mix of pastures, outbuildings, and dense woods that offered absolute privacy. To the outside world, this farm was a picture of southern prosperity. To the people living on it, the isolation was absolute. The mechanical hum of the city was replaced by the deafening drone of summer cicadas, the smell of damp red clay, and the heavy stillness of the rural South. This estate belonged to 58-year-old Gary Farris. He was a man who navigated two entirely different realities. By day, he was a powerhouse in the Atlanta legal community. As a highly successful commercial real estate attorney and a prominent partner at a top-tier firm, his intellect and work ethic were legendary. Colleagues noted his sharp mind, his ability to dissect complex contracts, and a demeanor that commanded respect in any boardroom. He was an imposing physical figure, weighing well over 300 pounds. Yet he was known for a pragmatic, even-keeled approach to problem-solving. He spent his days in tailored suits, navigating high-stakes negotiations in air-conditioned glass towers. He was the primary breadwinner, carrying the immense financial weight of his family's lifestyle on his shoulders without complaint. Gary was deeply dedicated to his practice, working grueling 60-hour weeks to ensure his 4 children had every advantage. Waiting for him at the end of that commute was his wife of nearly 4 decades, 64-year-old Melody Walker Farris. She managed the day-to-day operations of the farm, tending to the livestock and the acreage. While Gary thrived in the fast-paced, structured environment of corporate law, Melody was entrenched in the dirt and routine of rural life. The couple had raised their family on this land, but as the kids grew older and the main house emptied out, the 10 acres began to feel less like a sanctuary and more like a secluded compound. Gary's daily routine was punishing. He commuted over 30 miles each way through dense traffic, leaving the farm before the sun crested the tree line and returning long after dark. When he finally pulled his vehicles up the driveway, he traded his briefcase for work boots. Despite his demanding career, he never shied away from the physical labor required to maintain a working property. He could often be found on a heavy tractor on the weekends, clearing brush, repairing miles of fencing, or managing the estate's designated burn pile, a deep pit located about 100 yards from the main residence, used for disposing of fallen branches. He poured his earnings into the land, envisioning the farm as a quiet legacy for his family. But physical space does not equal emotional closeness. The sheer size of the Purcell Lane estate meant 2 people could exist on the same property for days without crossing paths. There were multiple structures, a massive primary residence, a large barn with a fully equipped apartment above it, and various sheds scattered across the terrain. This geographical distance perfectly mirrored a growing chasm between the husband and wife. The silence of the property, once its greatest selling point, became a suffocating presence. While Gary focused entirely on building a financial empire, the foundation of his home life was fracturing. He paid the bills, managed the accounts, and kept the expensive machinery of their lives running smoothly. Completely unaware that the vast isolation he worked so hard to finance was creating the perfect, unmonitored environment for his own destruction. 38 years is an eternity to share with one person. When a marriage spans almost 4 decades, the roots grow incredibly deep, but they can also become choked by resentment, transforming a shared foundation into a slow-moving prison. In the early days, the union was built on traditional lines, a mutual vision of stability, family, and carving out a secure piece of the world. But as the years bled together, the partnership devolved into a bitter, transactional coexistence. The Cherokee County farm stopped being a sanctuary. It morphed into a heavily contested battleground where the primary weapons were weaponized silence, financial leverage, and psychological warfare. Money was the central bleeding artery of their conflict. The attorney generated the entirety of the wealth, pulling in a substantial income from his relentless corporate grind. Naturally, he controlled the flow of that capital. To him, the funds were strictly allocated for maintaining the estate, supporting their adult children, and securing a tangible legacy in the soil. To his wife, the wealth was a tool for personal autonomy, a freedom she felt was severely and unfairly restricted. Her response to this perceived control was reckless, retaliatory spending. She opened multiple covert credit card accounts, rapidly racking up massive debts without his knowledge or consent. Packages would arrive continuously at the rural mailbox, filled with frivolous purchases she used to plug an emotional void. When the sprawling credit card statements inevitably surfaced, the resulting confrontations were explosive. The husband would demand accountability for the tens of thousands of dollars evaporating into thin air, his patience fraying under the financial strain. She would fiercely counter by insisting she was owed heavy compensation for decades of managing the massive property and raising their family. He threatened to completely sever her access to their joint checking accounts. She demanded an equal, unrestricted share of the empire he had spent his life building. The atmosphere inside the primary residence turned venomous. The couple abandoned any pretense of intimacy, sleeping in entirely separate wings of the large house. They navigated around each other like hostile inmates trapped in the same cell block. Family members noted the palpable, heavy tension whenever both were forced into the same room, the air instantly thickening with unspoken animosity. Through indirect accounts from their adult children, the grim reality of their daily lives was dragged into the light. The father would often express deep, bone-weary exhaustion, stating that he simply wanted a few hours of peace after grinding through brutal work weeks. The mother, conversely, complained bitterly to anyone who would listen about feeling trapped, isolated, and financially suffocated by a man she could no longer stand to look at. She frequently voiced her outright disdain, telling acquaintances that she despised his very presence and actively wished he would simply disappear. The resentment had calcified into pure, unadulterated hatred. Seeking a reprieve from the suffocating environment she helped create, the wife sought validation far beyond the fence line. She stepped way outside the boundaries of the marriage, engaging in secret, prolonged romantic relationships. This wasn't a fleeting moment of indiscretion. It was a calculated, sustained pattern of betrayal. She cultivated a hidden digital life, sending highly intimate text messages and arranging clandestine meetups away from the prying eyes of their tight-knit rural community. These affairs provided her with the intoxicating attention and control she felt utterly deprived of at home. In her mind, the infidelity was entirely justified, a necessary, righteous rebellion against a husband she viewed as an oppressive financial warden. The men she pursued stood in stark contrast to the disciplined, highly educated corporate lawyer she had married. They offered a reckless, chaotic escape from the rigid, crushing structure of her daily existence. But maintaining this double life required a tremendous amount of deceptive energy, adding another layer of volatile paranoia to a household already pushed to the brink. By the late spring of 2018, the marriage had reached terminal velocity. The attorney was actively, quietly, consulting with his legal colleagues about the grueling logistics of a divorce. He told close associates that his threshold had been breached, that he could no longer tolerate the relentless financial hemorrhaging and the toxic hostility waiting for him at the end of every long commute. But dismantling a union of that length is a complex, agonizing process. He hesitated. He knew that a legal separation would mean liquidating the sprawling farm he had worked his entire life to build, paying exorbitant alimony, and watching his hard-earned assets be ruthlessly split down the middle by the courts. For the wife, the prospect of divorce presented a terrifying, unacceptable reality. A legal dissolution meant losing her lavish, insulated lifestyle overnight. She would be forced off the sprawling property, permanently stripped of her social standing, and left with a mere fraction of the wealth she felt entitled to. The financial arithmetic in her mind was brutal and absolute. Remaining legally bound to a man she despised was intolerable, but divorcing him meant total financial ruin. The trap had closed tight. As the heavy, suffocating Georgia heat set in that summer, the tension was building toward an inevitable breaking point. The secluded estate was rapidly transforming from a fractured home into the staging ground for a permanent, violent solution. Early July in Cherokee County brings a specific kind of atmospheric misery. The humidity clings to the skin like a wet canvas, thick and unyielding. The air is entirely stagnant, smelling of hot asphalt and damp red clay. In 2018, as the 4th of July holiday approached, the Purcell Lane estate was locked in this oppressive weather pattern. Distant fireworks occasionally echoed through the pine trees, a low rhythmic booming that provided the perfect auditory cover for the violence about to unfold. The prominent attorney was taking a rare break from his corporate firm, spending the holiday week at the farm. His wife was also home. They were completely isolated on the 10-acre property, cut off from the eyes of their colleagues, friends, and neighbors. The vast space that was meant to be a refuge had become a locked pressure cooker, and the structural integrity of their toxic marriage was finally giving way. The primary residence featured a sprawling, unfinished basement. It was a functional space, holding tools, seasonal storage, and hunting equipment. Built into the sloping earth, the lower level was naturally cool, surrounded by thick concrete foundation walls that deadened sound. It was the husband's domain, a place where he stored his gear and managed the mechanical upkeep of the farm. Sometime during the early days of July, the simmering hostility between the couple migrated down the wooden stairs into this subterranean space. The exact catalyst for the final confrontation remains buried in the ashes, but the psychological groundwork had been laid over years of financial bleeding and deep-seated hatred, a demand for accountability, a definitive threat to dissolve the marriage and liquidate the assets, a final, absolute refusal to continue funding an extravagant, deceptive lifestyle. The verbal dispute escalated rapidly in the dim light of the basement. The tension, stretched to its absolute limit over 38 years, finally snapped. No screaming, no prolonged physical struggle, just a sudden, violent finality. A .38 caliber handgun was leveled. The trigger was pulled. The sharp, deafening crack of the gunshot violently breached the heavy silence of the concrete room. A single piece of lead tore through tissue and bone, striking the attorney square in the chest. The massive kinetic energy of the impact halted him instantly. Over 300 pounds of dead weight collapsed heavily onto the hard floor. The bullet drove deep into his torso, ultimately shattering and lodging firmly inside a rib bone. He bled out rapidly on the cold concrete. In a matter of seconds, a man who commanded boardrooms and built a financial empire was reduced to a lifeless obstacle on his own basement floor. Silence returned to the subterranean room, leaving behind the sharp, metallic odor of gunpowder and rapidly pooling blood. But the execution was only the beginning of the nightmare. The immediate, terrifying reality of physics set in. Moving a human body of that immense size is an extreme mechanical challenge. A woman in her 60s cannot simply lift or carry a man of that stature. The disposal required cold calculation, mechanical leverage, and sheer, grueling physical exertion. A large, heavy tarp or piece of thick canvas was unrolled onto the concrete. The remains had to be rolled and wrestled onto the material. The friction of dragging that much dead weight across a rough floor required immense effort. During this desperate struggle, the cleanup was compromised. As the heavy package was maneuvered toward the lower-level walkout doors, wet smears of blood transferred onto the surrounding surfaces. Deep red stains seeped into the wooden trim at the base of the basement stairs, microscopic markers of a desperate struggle against gravity. The heavy exterior door was shoved open. The blistering July heat rushed into the cool basement. The package was dragged out into the dirt, leaving a wide, unnatural furrow in the dust. A piece of heavy farm machinery, a tractor or utility vehicle, was backed directly up to the exit. Using a combination of makeshift ramps, leverage, and raw desperation, the tarp was hoisted into the cargo bed. The engine turned over, breaking the rural silence. The destination was exactly 100 yards away from the main house. Over the years, the property owner had built and maintained a designated burn pit on the edge of the tree line. It was a massive, deep depression in the earth, heavily loaded with dry brush, fallen oak branches, and discarded household debris. He had spent countless weekend hours clearing his land and throwing the refuse into this very pit. It was a routine, practical element of farm management. Now, the pit he built was repurposed as his own makeshift crematorium. The vehicle backed up to the edge of the depression. The tarp was pulled. The heavy remains tumbled down into the tangled web of dry wood and debris. Liquid accelerant was poured aggressively over the wood, the canvas, and the body. The sharp chemical fumes of gasoline warped the humid air. A flame was introduced to the edge of the pit. The ignition was instantaneous and violent. A massive column of orange fire and black smoke roared upward, consuming the oxygen and radiating blistering heat. But destroying a human body in an open-air environment is not a rapid process. It is a grueling, time-consuming endeavor. Cremation requires sustained thermal temperatures exceeding 1,500 degrees Fahrenheit. The initial blaze, fueled by gasoline, would burn out too quickly to reduce bone to ash. The fire had to be actively, meticulously managed. This required an unimaginable level of psychological detachment. For hours and bleeding into days, the perpetrator had to stand near the roaring heat of the July fire, breathing in the oily, dense smoke of burning tissue. The fire demanded constant labor. More heavy wood had to be chopped and hauled to the pit. The embers had to be continually stoked with long iron tools to maintain the critical thermal threshold. The killer had to repeatedly approach the lip of the inferno, staring down into the flames to ensure the destruction was absolute, feeding the pyre every time the heat began to drop. It was the grueling, sweaty, horrific physical labor of murder. Over the holiday week, a thick, persistent plume of gray smoke rolled continuously across the 10-acre property. The wind carried it over the fence lines and out toward the main road. The smell was heavy and acrid. Neighbors driving past noted the smoke rising above the tree line. Yet this was rural Georgia. Tending a brush fire in the summer, especially around the 4th of July, was an entirely normal, benign activity. No alarms were raised. No one dialed 911. The surrounding community simply assumed the family was catching up on routine yard work. While the fire raged outside, the interior cover-up commenced. The basement was scrubbed with harsh industrial chemicals. Mops pushed bleach-heavy water across the concrete floor, desperately trying to erase the metallic scent and the biological markers of the execution. The area was reorganized to look undisturbed, but the frantic, exhausted scrubbing missed the faint, rusted discoloration on the stair trim. The trap had been sprung, the body destroyed, and the evidence seemingly turned to vapor. The farm fell back into a deceptive, terrifying quiet. The corporate machine operates on rigid, unforgiving schedules. By the time the post-holiday work week resumed, the silence emanating from the Farris household was deafening. The attorney was a man who lived and died by his calendar, a professional who answered complex legal emails before dawn, and never, under any circumstances, missed a scheduled conference call. But when his downtown Atlanta firm opened its doors, his corner office remained dark and empty. High-priority calls from junior partners and anxious clients went straight to voicemail, greeted only by his automated, recorded voice. The digital infrastructure of his heavily managed life simply stalled out. This was not a man prone to spontaneous retreats or unannounced sabbaticals. His colleagues immediately recognized a fundamental breach in his pattern. The gears of his career had stopped turning, and the alarm bells began to ring. Simultaneously, a deep, creeping anxiety began to ripple through the family network. The adult children had not heard from their father in days, a stark deviation from his usual constant communication. When they reached out to their mother at the farm, the responses they received were evasive, disjointed, and bizarrely casual. She suggested he might be out walking the vast property, tending to routine farm chores, or perhaps taking a quiet moment for himself. But the 10-acre estate on Purcell Lane was not a dense wilderness. If he was there, he would be visible or reachable. The sheer isolation of the Cherokee County farm, originally purchased as a buffer against the chaotic outside world, now felt like a sprawling, impenetrable fortress hiding a terrible reality. Driven by a mounting sense of visceral dread, one of their adult sons made the definitive decision to physically travel to the estate to locate his father. The drive up the long, winding gravel path was accompanied only by the heavy drone of summer cicadas and the crunch of tires on stone. When he parked near the main residence, the atmosphere was uniquely, heavily unsettled. His mother emerged, but she did not share his frantic, escalating urgency. Her demeanor was inexplicably flat, a chilling contrast to a wife whose husband of nearly 40 years had vanished without a trace. Unsatisfied with her vague explanations and lack of concern, the son pivoted away from the house and began a systematic physical search of the acreage himself. The mid-July heat was suffocating, pressing down on the pastures like a wet blanket. As he navigated past the large barn and the various storage sheds, a distinct, acrid scent caught his attention in the stagnant air. It wasn't the clean, familiar smell of a standard agricultural brush fire. It was dense, oily, and clung to the back of the throat. He followed the invisible trail of the scent, walking past the manicured lawns, down the slight slope, and moving steadily toward the heavy, shaded tree line at the edge of the property. The designated burn pit came into view. It was an enormous depression in the earth, and it was still actively smoking. A deep bed of white and gray ash filled the crater, with waves of extreme heat shimmering in the humid air above it. The son approached the lip of the pit, his boots slipping slightly on the dry soil. He peered down into the smoldering, blackened debris, scanning for any sign of his missing father. He noticed irregular shapes mixed amidst the charred oak branches and melted household refuse. They were not wood, they were structural, porous, a fragment of bone, a partial skull cap. The realization was immediate, total, and physically paralyzing. The ashes in the pit belonged to a human being. The massive pile of debris had been utilized to consume a body. High tension, short breaths, the immediate reach for a cell phone. He contacted Cherokee County Emergency Dispatch without hesitation. He reported finding human remains in the family's backyard fire pit, his voice tight, conveying the sheer, unadulterated trauma of the gruesome discovery. While he stood near the blistering heat, waiting for law enforcement to arrive, his mother remained inside the house, inexplicably detached from the nightmare unfolding just 100 yards from her back porch. Sirens soon shattered the deep rural quiet. Multiple patrol vehicles kicked up thick clouds of red dust as they tore down Purcell Lane, lights flashing against the green canopy. First responders aggressively taped off the perimeter, establishing a wide exclusion zone around the smoldering depression. The scene they encountered was catastrophic. The environment was completely compromised by extreme thermal damage. The fire had been so intense and evidently sustained for such a prolonged period that recovering intact biological evidence seemed mathematically impossible. The initial assessment formulated by the arriving deputies heavily favored a tragic, albeit horrifying, farm accident. The victim was a heavy man, weighing well over 300 pounds, and possessed a documented history of cardiovascular issues. He frequently worked the property completely alone, utilizing heavy machinery and managing that exact fire pit on a regular basis. The working theory established on the spot was that the attorney had been out laboring in the brutal, unforgiving July heat, suffered a sudden and massive cardiac event, and accidentally tumbled forward into the active, roaring flames. It was a clean, logical explanation for an incredibly chaotic scene. A grim medical emergency, a terrible accident, not a calculated, cold-blooded homicide. As specialized crime scene technicians and the coroner's unit arrived to begin the grueling, archaeological process of sifting through the hot ash, the social echo of the event began to rapidly reverberate through the surrounding county. The local community was entirely stunned. The juxtaposition was simply too sharp for the mind to easily process. A highly educated, immaculately dressed corporate lawyer dying a primitive, fiery death in a backyard pit became the sole topic of hushed conversation in diners, hardware stores, and country clubs across the region. Neighbors suddenly recalled the thick, gray smoke they had seen lingering over the Farris tree line for days, a cold realization washing over them as they understood what had actually been fueling the flames. The isolation of the farm had finally been breached by flashing lights and yellow tape, but the sprawling property had already swallowed its master. The initial hypothesis of a tragic medical event collapsed entirely within 72 hours. The local medical examiner's office, working in conjunction with state crime lab technicians, undertook the agonizing process of sifting through the recovered debris. Thermal destruction of that magnitude is severe, but human bone is highly resilient. During a microscopic examination of the charred remains, forensic anthropologists isolated a distinct anomaly embedded deep within a fragment of rib bone. It was not organic material. It was a severely deformed piece of lead, a spent .38 caliber bullet. The trajectory of the case pivoted instantly. A man suffering a massive heart attack does not somehow shoot himself in the chest before falling into a fire. The accidental death theory was completely discarded. The Cherokee County Sheriff's Office was now navigating a complex, calculated homicide investigation. Armed with the confirmation of a gunshot wound, detectives immediately returned to the Purcell Lane estate with sweeping search warrants. The property was no longer a grieving family's sanctuary. It was an active crime scene. Investigators systematically moved through the main residence, focusing their attention on the lower level where the victim spent the majority of his time. To the naked eye, the basement appeared orderly. The concrete floor smelled faintly of industrial bleach and cleaning solvents. But chemical concealment is rarely absolute. Forensic technicians darkened the subterranean room and applied luminol. The reaction was immediate and undeniable. A brilliant blue luminescence illuminated the concrete, revealing the faint but unmistakable pattern of a massive blood pool near the workbench. The glowing trail did not end there. It extended across the floor, documenting a wide, heavy drag path that moved directly toward the exterior walkout doors. Further inspection of the wooden trim at the base of the stairs yielded physical swabs of biological material that had soaked deep into the grain, subsequently matched to the attorney's DNA. The execution site was officially confirmed. The focus shifted heavily to the remaining inhabitants of the farm. When investigators sat down with the widow, they expected to encounter a woman shattered by the confirmation that her husband had been violently murdered. Instead, her demeanor remained unnervingly flat. Her emotional register was entirely vacant. She offered no viable theories, expressed no outrage, and provided only clipped, evasive answers regarding her movements during the holiday week. But when pressed by seasoned detectives, she finally offered a definitive direction for their inquiry. She did not point outward toward an unknown intruder or a disgruntled former client from his corporate firm. She pointed the finger directly at her own blood. She suggested investigators look closely at their adult son. This revelation sent the investigation careening down a massive, highly frustrating red herring. The son resided on the exact same 10-acre property, occupying the apartment located directly above the main barn. The physical proximity alone made him a highly viable suspect. Furthermore, detectives quickly learned that the relationship between the father and son was heavily strained, marked by frequent, intense arguments over property management and personal conduct. The most damning piece of circumstantial evidence was immediately uncovered during a background check. The son legally owned a .38 caliber handgun. A search of his barn apartment yielded a box of ammunition that perfectly matched the grain and caliber of the deformed bullet extracted from the burn pit. The detectives hit a solid wall of confirmation bias. The narrative seemed neatly wrapped: a volatile son, absolute physical access, extreme proximity to the disposal site, and matching ballistic evidence. Weeks were consumed as investigators aggressively pursued this angle, subpoenaing the son's financial records, meticulously analyzing his movements, and attempting to break his alibi. The local community, feeding on the rapid spread of rumors, began to whisper about a violent generational dispute. The tension within the county amplified, fueled by the horrific idea of a son executing his own father and burning the remains in the backyard. But the timeline refused to solidify. The son's alibi held up under intense, repeated scrutiny, and his emotional reaction to his father's brutal death was raw and authentic, starkly contrasting the cold detachment displayed by his mother. Detectives found themselves bogged down in family drama, spinning their wheels while the true architect of the crime sat quietly in the main house. Frustrated by the stalled momentum and the lingering inconsistencies, the lead investigators executed a strategic pivot. They stopped looking at the physical terrain of the farm and shifted their focus entirely to the digital terrain of the widow's life. Comprehensive warrants were drafted for her cell phone records, bank statements, and credit histories. The digital footprint completely shattered her carefully constructed facade. Financial analysts uncovered a massive web of hidden debt. The widow had secretly accumulated tens of thousands of dollars in credit card liabilities, a severe financial burden that was entirely concealed from her husband until shortly before his death. The motive for murder rapidly materialized. A pending divorce would have exposed the extensive fraud, severed her access to his corporate income, and forced the total liquidation of the estate. But the financial ruin was only a fraction of the digital evidence. The data extraction from her cellular device revealed a sprawling, highly active secret life. Detectives documented sustained, intimate communications with multiple paramours, men she had been meeting covertly for months. The image of a dedicated, hard-working farm wife dissolved entirely, replaced by a portrait of a woman deeply entrenched in deception. The decisive breakthrough, the smoking gun that definitively cleared the sun and placed the crosshairs squarely on the matriarch, was found buried within thousands of deleted text messages. Forensic specialists recovered a specific exchange sent from the widow's phone to one of her romantic partners just weeks before the execution in the basement. The message was devoid of any ambiguity. She explicitly detailed her deep, venomous hatred for her husband. She complained bitterly about his financial control and his mere physical presence. And then, utilizing stark, violent language, she stated that she actively wished he would die, noting precisely how much easier her life would be if he were simply erased from existence. The frustration that had plagued the detective bureau evaporated in an instant. The red herring involving the son was recognized for exactly what it was: a calculated, ruthless tactical deflection by a mother willing to sacrifice her own child to maintain her freedom and her wealth. The physical evidence of the bleach cleanup, the extreme proximity of the fire pit, the crushing financial motive, and the documented malice all converged into a single, undeniable point of failure. Arrest warrants were rapidly drafted. Cherokee County Sheriff's deputies returned to the Purcell Lane estate one final time, navigating the long gravel driveway not to search for clues, but to place handcuffs on the woman who had literally burned her marriage to the ground. In late 2024, the architect of the Farris execution finally faced a Cherokee County jury. The sprawling acreage was traded for a sterile, fluorescent-lit courtroom. Over the course of an intense 18-day trial, the prosecution systematically laid out a mountain of digital and forensic evidence. They presented a stark portrait of a woman who chose murder over a messy divorce, unwilling to relinquish her grip on a fortune she felt entitled to. The defense mounted a desperate counteroffensive. They attempted to revive the narrative of severe family dysfunction, once again casting shadows toward the adult son. But the jury saw directly through the deflection. The physical proof, the blood markers on the basement concrete, the deformed bullet extracted from the pit, and those deeply damning text messages, was insurmountable. Deliberation was swift and absolute. The jury returned a definitive verdict, guilty on all charges, including malice murder and concealing a death. The presiding judge handed down the maximum penalty, life in prison, plus an additional consecutive 5 years. The woman who ruled her rural compound with deceptive silence was quietly escorted out in handcuffs, permanently exiled to a cinder block cell, entirely stripped of the wealth she killed to protect. The gated acreage in Cherokee County is quiet once again, but the heavy silence that blankets the property is no longer a symbol of peace. It is the echo of total, irreversible ruin. A sprawling farm, originally purchased to build a lasting legacy, ultimately served as a slaughterhouse and a makeshift crematorium. A brilliant mind was reduced to fragments of bone, all to satisfy a horrific, calculated greed. The land endures, but a family was completely incinerated from the inside out. Please like this video and share your thoughts about this case in the comments. Be sure to check out our previous videos as well. See you soon.